For as long as humans have been climbing, the act itself has always carried unavoidable risk. And no matter how that experience may be presented, whether through a fictional film based on real events or a documentary trying to capture reality as it is, one element keeps resurfacing in climbing stories: human survival. This video is part 2 in a 5-part series that aims to explore the question, why do people climb? And analyze how different mediums try to capture and convey the answer. While the previous video is not a prerequisite for understanding this one, I do recommend checking it out if you're interested in seeing how the human limit is observed through documentaries. To understand why survival sits right at the center of climbing narratives, it helps to break this video into 3 parts. The origins of climbing before it was ever captured on camera, how it's been translated into different sub-mediums of film, documentaries, fictional movies and docudramas, and how each of these mediums shapes the way we interpret high-risk situations. Each medium presents the same moments differently, sometimes as they happened, sometimes as reconstructed versions, and sometimes in a fictionalized way, all with their own limitations and strengths that will become clearer through specific examples from each category. If you're coming into The Alpinist after watching the more popular Free Solo documentary, the first thing that might stand out is that the narrator is not Marc-André Leclerc himself, but Peter Mortimer. He is the co-director of 2 other climbing documentaries, Valley Uprising and The Downwall, both of which I've covered in the previous video. Usually, the documented climber is the one that narrates his journey and shares his thoughts, but in The Alpinist, Marc appears mostly as an observed subject. For much of the film, the story is told through the voices of friends, family and other professional climbers. It's only in the final third of the film that Marc himself narrates some of his preparation and journey of climbing Torre Eger in Argentina. Outside of that, his perspective is presented directly through a Q&A interview style. If you're not familiar with his story going into this documentary, this narrative approach might initially seem like an unusual artistic choice. But towards the end of the movie, the narrator reveals that Marc-André Leclerc died during his descent of the Mendenhall Towers in Alaska. Initially, this documentary was planned as a portrait of Marc while he was still actively climbing, focusing on his quiet and reserved approach to some of the most difficult solo ascents in the world. But after his death in 2018, the film became a reflection on his life and his relationship with climbing, told through the people who knew him best. In the end, it stands as a memorial to his achievements and legacy. To understand what's happening throughout the films in this video, it helps to get familiar with some of the basic climbing terminology and the broader history behind the subject. In the previous video on climbing, I went through some of its history, namely what we'd call today modern climbing, which has its roots in Yosemite National Park in California. But to really place it in context, it helps to go further back. What people refer to as climbing is a very general layman's term that can refer to 3 distinct practices. Rock climbing, which generally describes ascending vertical rock faces, usually with a focus on precise technical movement. Second is alpinism, which refers to high-altitude ascents in alpine environments, where the difficulty comes from both technical terrain and the harsh, often unpredictable weather conditions. And third is mountaineering, which is a broader term covering any form of climbing in mountainous environments, often combining hiking, snow travel, rock, ice or mixed climbing depending on the route. In fact, Yosemite's early rock climbing culture initially developed in part as a training ground for more general mountaineering objectives. Before the 18th century, people moved through mountainous terrain out of necessity or curiosity, rather than a defined activity. Even earlier, high places often carried spiritual and symbolic meaning in certain cultures, where elevation was sometimes associated with closeness to the divine. If a clear starting point for climbing as a structured activity can be identified, it is often traced to 1786, when the first recorded ascent of Mont Blanc in the European Alps was completed. This is also where the term alpinism originates from. Following this, the early exploratory period of mountaineering developed further in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as naturalists, scientists and adventurers attempted first ascents across the Alps. This led into what is known as the Golden Age of Alpinism in the mid-19th century, defined by systematic efforts to summit the remaining major alpine peaks. Documentation from this time comes mainly from written accounts, sketches, and paintings, since film did not yet exist. From there, climbing gradually evolved into distinct disciplines such as rock climbing, ice climbing, and high-altitude mountaineering, eventually forming the modern global climbing culture seen today. Incidentally, together with Yosemite's birth of rock climbing culture, a revolution in alpinism philosophy happened at the same time in Europe. Before the 1950s, expeditions were usually carried out on a large scale, involving lots of equipment and manpower. But once most of the major peaks had been conquered, the next step in climbing was to focus on style and technique. Solo alpinism emerged from this shift as both a philosophy and a practice. It refers to climbing alone, without a partner, but not necessarily without equipment. Free soloing, on the other hand, specifically means climbing without any ropes or protection, where a single mistake is fatal. Mark engaged in both forms, climbing the Emperor face of Mount Robson in Canada in a free solo style, having used zero safety gear. However, if that wasn't crazy enough already, I should also mention that he did the ascent in an on-site manner, meaning that he hadn't practiced the route beforehand. Alpinist Barry Blanchard describes it as the gold standard of alpinism, and for good reason. It is by far the most dangerous and extreme form of alpinism. If Alex Honnold, the first and only person in history to free solo El Capitan, calls something messed up, then it's safe to assume that it really is. As Mark prepares for his next big milestone, a winter solo climb of Torre Ager, one of the hardest peaks in the Americas, he shares an interesting perspective on climbing. For him, soloing doesn't just mean climbing the mountain by himself, but being entirely secluded from other humans. Film crews are obviously out of the question, but he goes as far as leaving behind any communication device. Mike Tyson's quote about boxing being the loneliest sport in the world is nothing to scoff at, but being kilometers away from civilization, where if you died no one will even know for days, comes pretty close to the idea of loneliness. And as we'll see later in Touching the Void, it goes beyond loneliness altogether. At the beginning of the documentary, when asked why he climbs, Mark describes it as a casual fun adventure. But as the film moves deeper into his journey and background, it becomes apparent that there's much more behind it. Mark was diagnosed with ADHD at an early age and struggled to fit in at school. To him, a place like that felt like imprisonment, but once he discovered climbing, it was like he found a form of freedom. When he talks about soloing those insane peaks, he says that even though he is well aware of how dangerous it is, he is drawn to it by the experience itself. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the sense of immersion and the heightened awareness that climbing gives him is a major driving force for why he climbs. When he uses the ice axes to secure himself to an ice wall, even though the axes themselves don't have nerves, it's like the tools become an extension of his body. When he hikes towards a mountain, his senses become heightened, allowing him to tune into every change in his surroundings and almost feel the presence of the mountain itself. That level of focus and intensity might be especially meaningful for someone with ADHD, where that kind of sustained focus is less common in everyday environments. This idea of freedom has been a recurring motivation for climbing. Almost every climber from the documentaries I've gone through so far has mentioned it at least once, and this is not the last time we'll hear it. But what exactly is freedom? And freedom from what? This is where we step into some of the spiritual implications of climbing. While this is ultimately a personal idea that differs from climber to climber, there are at least three recurring forms of freedom that appear throughout these stories. The first is something that also appears in Valley Uprising and was partly a product of his time, a form of freedom that stemmed from an antithesis of the ordinary. In the context of the 1950s American life, climbing was freedom in a rebellious sense, that is, the opposite of social expectations and conventional living. Later, when climbing became more mainstream, the freedom that climbers will refer to seemed to be related to the mind and the body. So climbers will consider bypassing their physical limits and mental barriers as freedom. And in the more recent decades, freedom seems to have evolved into a liberation from the collective. What I mean by that is that in a globalized world where we can be aware of everything that's happening around us, Freedom seems to be a form of self-imposed isolation that brings us closer to nature. Alex Honnold, Marc-André Leclerc, and Simon Yates all touch on variations of this idea. However, this sense of spiritual freedom is not unique to modern alpinism. Wanderer Above the Sea Fog by Caspar David Friedrich is one of the most iconic paintings of the early 19th century. It depicts a man in a Rücken figure pose staring at the vast fog before him and contemplating the landscape. The writers and painters of that age had been fascinated with the sublime, the overwhelming, vast and spiritually charged aspect of nature. There have been many works that reference the painting, probably one of the most recognizable in recent times being the cover art for Breath of the Wild. Many of the vistas present in The Alpinist echo this same visual language, and Mark's reflections on the mountains carry a similar sense of awe and immersion. As one of these video's objectives is to explore how different mediums shape the way we experience human survival vicariously, it's useful to look at the main types of documentary filmmaking. I mentioned earlier how The Alpinist was completed posthumously in 2021, 3 years after Mark's death. That makes it an interesting hybrid documentary, combining elements of observational and participatory filmmaking. The observational aspect is most visible in the climbing sections, which have minimal to no intervention or guidance from the filmmaker, and the subject is mostly observed. The participatory structure is used to incorporate interviews from relatives and from Mark himself. Other documentary types include expository, which is not relevant for this video. Those are usually National Geographic style, where heavy narration is used to guide the viewer through nature or historical footage. Then there's reflexive documentaries, where the focus is on the filmmaking process itself. There are some elements of this at the end of Free Solo. And lastly, performative, which focuses on the emotional and personal interpretation of an event, rather than the objective truth. This one is very close to a docudrama such as Touching the Void. If you were to put documentaries, docudramas, and movies based on real events on a spectrum from the least to the most realistic, it will look something like this. This brings up an interesting question and the core of the video. What is the point in fictionalizing an event if it can be shown through documentary footage? Both the 2015 Everest and the 2003 Touching the Void approach that question in different ways. First of all, what makes mountaineering an act of survival? As I touched on earlier, it has to do with the conditions of the climb. When you're rock climbing, the primary limiting factors are your physical strength, stamina, and technical ability. But with mountaineering, and especially alpinism, those factors are compounded by elements that are often outside of the climber's control, such as extreme cold, altitude, weather, and the constant risk of frostbite and oxygen deprivation. Unlike rock climbing, where retreat is often possible through rappelling, alpinism involves committing to environments where descent can be just as difficult, if not more dangerous than continuing upward. And God forbid something goes seriously wrong, such as a heavy injury, survival becomes the only priority. The events depicted in the 2015 Everest movie are based on a 1996 disaster, when a sudden and severe storm struck multiple expedition teams during their descent, leaving several climbers stranded high on the mountain and resulting in multiple fatalities. The tragedy was later documented in books such as Into Thin Air and The Climb, each offering a different perspective on the events and the decisions that led to the outcome. These two books will also be the focus of the fourth video in this climbing series. The film adaptation remains relatively faithful to the real tragedy, while still shaping the events into a more structured and dramatized narrative. While the 96 disaster is well documented through survivor accounts and books, there is very little actual footage from the most critical moments on the mountain. The conditions themselves made filming nearly impossible, and once the situation escalated, survival took priority over documentation. As a result, much of what happened exists only through personal recollection. A film like Everest fills in those gaps by reconstructing events that could not be captured on camera, allowing the viewer to experience not just the facts of the disaster, but the scale, tension, and the human decisions that defined it. Another reason for dramatizing an event like this is the need for coherence. The 1996 disaster was very complex. It involved multiple themes, dozens of climbers, and a series of overlapping decisions that unfolded across different parts of the mountain. When told through individual accounts, the event can feel fragmented, with each perspective capturing only a small portion of what actually happened. By introducing selective reconstruction and shaping those events into a single narrative thread, the movie is able to present a clearer, more unified picture. While this will inevitably involve compromising on some aspects, ultimately it does help the viewer understand the sequence of events and the general scale of the disaster in a way that raw accounts alone might not be able to convey. One of the major differences between the movie and the real event is the condensation of the scale. The real event involved around 50 people, including the clients, guides, and Sherpas. The movie cuts that number to just about a dozen, with additional background climbers appearing in passing. For a 2-hour runtime, even managing that reduced character cast becomes difficult, and as a result, only a few characters receive meaningful development. Another difference has to do with the time frame and the weather. The actual event took place from May 10th, when the first storm approached in the evening, to May 12th, when the situation started to stabilize. The movie compresses it into a continuous survival sequence across one night. As for the weather, the real-life conditions fluctuated over the first 2 days, but the movie depicts it as one sudden continuous storm. I don't find much issue in either of those two choices, to be honest, because I don't think what this movie was aiming for was to be a one-to-one reconstruction of reality, but rather, it more so tried to convey the overall intensity of the situation. And I think it did it quite well. The first half of the movie introduces the wide cast of characters and establishes some of the risks involved in climbing Everest. The main focus falls on Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, the two expedition leaders, as well as climbers such as Doug Hansen, Beck Weathers, Yasko Namba, and John Krakauer. Supporting roles include Anatoly Bukreyev as one of the key rescuers, as well as Helen Wilton and Caroline McKenzie at base camp, who help with the coordination side of the expedition. It's in the second half of the movie where I feel like the dramatization really shines. As the situation collapses and you're watching those people die in such terrible ways, you can only feel sorry for them. Each death feels equally meaningful and shows how terrifying it must have been to be there. The movie does not end on a happy note at all. The people left behind by the ones who died and the heavy injuries that the ones who survived lived with, it's all depicted in a regretful and sorrowful manner. 1/3 into the movie, the characters share some of the reasons for why they took on the expedition. Some do it out of completionism, some to motivate others, and some do it because the mountain is right there. Some people do it precisely because it is hard. This feeling is also reflected by Reinhold Messner in The Alpinist, who says that
if the death was not a possibility, coming out would be nothing. It would be kindergarten, but not an adventure and not an art.
in some alpinists' eyes, the survival aspect of climbing is not just an undesirable outcome, but it's a philosophy on the importance of difficulty. This feeling has been reflected across multiple disciplines, one of the most popular and recent advocates of this ideology being David Goggins. However, as seen in Everest, survival should not be something to be romanticized. Difficulty is of course important to establish the magnitude of a feat. If anyone could solo Torre Egger or El Capitan, no one will care about it. But in survival movies, the distinction between lived experience and cinematic spectacle can start to blur, risking dissociation between the viewer and the real human cost behind those events. And it is precisely this balance that becomes central when looking at docudramas like Touching the Void, where reconstruction is used to bridge the gap between documented reality and subjective experience. The way Touching the Void achieves this is through its structure. To briefly explain what the film is about, it retells Simon Yates and Joe Simpson's 1985 attempt to climb the west face of Ciula Grande, a 20,000-foot peak in Peru. The film has a very small cast consisting of only the two climbers, along with Richard Hawking, a fellow climber who stayed at the base camp as the expedition support member. This limited cast stands in direct contrast to that of Everest and allows the film to dive really deep into the events themselves, as well as the psychological state of the climbers during the descent. I say descent because even going into this movie blind, it becomes apparent very early that this film is not going to be about reaching the summit. Joe and Simon arrive at the top less than 20 minutes into the movie, and the rest of the runtime is a slow, agonizing attempt to make it back down alive. The structure of the movie is very simple. It alternates between present-day interviews of the real-life climbers and reconstructed sequences filmed using professional actors and stunt doubles. The entirety of the movie is narrated by Simon, Joe, and Richard, while the reconstructed footage has very little dialogue from the actors themselves. This really helps ground it in reality, because the subjective experience narrated by both climbers gives off a much more personal feeling than if some of the scenes had been dramatized through scripted dialogue. The film does have a soundtrack, but it is utilized in a restrained manner. It is generally employed only during narration over landscape-wide shots and occasionally intense sequences. Most of the key moments, however, are left in silence, which really enhances the unsettling atmosphere. Where I feel like this film really shines is the rawness of its presentation. Joe and Simon's accounts of the events are narrated in such an unfiltered and direct manner that they can feel almost foreign in their intensity. It's unlike anything a normal person will ever have experienced. The gaps and pauses in their retellings only reinforce the severity of what they went through. It's almost as if the language becomes insufficient to describe the horror, and the reconstructed sequences help fill in some of the gaps. Moreover, Richard's perspective is such a fitting addition to this agonizing story. His role is that of a direct observer, and what he describes is not the experience of survival itself, but the moment its consequences become visible. Hearing him recount the final stages of the situation brings a more familiar, human perspective into this account of human survival. As you're watching the film, you know that both Joe and Simon survive, since they are the ones narrating the events. Yet you can't help but ask, how in the world does someone even come out alive from this? I'd rather not spoil too much of the actual story, because this is the kind of documentary that is best experienced knowing as little as possible going in. However, I have to say that beyond striking a great balance between dramatization and realism, it also indirectly touches on some very profound themes regarding near-death experiences. More exactly, how someone's belief or disbelief in a higher being can affect the interpretation of the event, as well as the moment-to-moment experience of survival itself while it was unfolding. The biggest difference between documentaries, fictionalized movies, and docudramas has to do with the idea of suspension of disbelief. When you're watching a documentary like Free Solo or The Alpinist, you know that everything that's being filmed happens in situ, meaning that nothing is reconstructed or reinterpreted. What you're seeing is what unfolded in real life. There might be some cinematic techniques used to emphasize the scale of a cliff or the depth of a rock face, but most of what is shown is captured in a way that tries to present the event objectively. In a movie like Everest, even though it is based on a real event, at the end of the day, none of what we see is real in the literal sense. None of the actors died, and everything is staged in safely controlled conditions, with CGI often used to enhance the visual components. So, when you see Doug or Beck die, to engage with the film as a story, the viewer essentially enters into an implicit contract, an agreement, where the expectation is to suspend their disbelief. In a docudrama, this suspension of disbelief is reduced. The narrators are the actual people who experience the events, and what is being replicated is done so to supplement reality, rather than substitute it. So, to come back to the question of why should a tragedy be dramatized at all, it has to do with the limitations of each medium. At the end of the day, even documentaries can't fully capture every side of human survival in its entirety. They can of course get very close to it, showing the physical, mental and spiritual aspects, but there is still a limit to the portrayal of them. When we're talking about cases where footage is not even available, that becomes one place where fictional movies and docudramas can supplement by adding artificial tension, narrative structure and a cohesive plot. That of course comes at the cost of realism, but there will always be a trade-off. If I were to describe Touching the Void in one word, it'd be uncomfortable. The reconstructed horrifying scenes of unadulterated agony and the emotionally charged ending were both fascinating to watch. But I think the part that hit the hardest for me was the brief closing line at the end of the documentary. Imagine going through the loneliest, most painful and desperate experience a human being could suffer. Somehow you come out alive, and at the end of the day you say, I'll do it again. Early in The Alpinist, Alex Honnold is asked, why take the risk, why not use a rope? And he called that question dumb. While it may seem like a sarcastic answer, in a way there's really no better way to put it, because there is no logical answer to it. Even if you take it a step down from free soloing and look at free climbing the same mountain face, we go from extremely dangerous to just very dangerous. The moment someone ventures 1,000 feet onto a mountain face, they've left reason behind long ago. Choosing to risk dying alone, thousands of feet above the ground, is telling your most basic human instinct, that of self-preservation, no, I am going there to face death. Climbing has almost never been about pragmatism or logic. It's something much more personal, it's something intrinsically driven. Many of the climbers I've talked about so far have mentioned how climbing can drive them into a different state of mind. While I am well aware that it's not a mirror of reality in any shape or form, in the next video in this series I will still like to explore how video games approach the question of why do people climb from a meditative standpoint, and if their interactivity can grant us even a tiny glimpse of some of the many introspective aspects of climbing.